Come in. Hi. I've been poring over this book. It's a terrific book. Pattern of Expectation by I.F.Clarke. What a great name. I think if I ever had another kid, I'd call him Ignatius. What a cool name. So, this book dates to 1979. Clarke himself was born in 1918 and lived across the rest of the 20th century and died in 2009. Very much the old school scholar, very interested in the future, particularly literature about the future and the role of imagination. So that means I want to step back for a moment and touch on a few other books which really pertain to this, and he was developing the language, and it's really interesting reading a book like this where you feel it's like he's writing from a very different time. He has a different prose, a different meter to his prose. It's very much like writing, for me, reading a book from the first half of the 20th century, particularly, even though this was written in the 1970s. But yeah, I want to, I'm not going to dwell too much on that other than to note that voice is very interestingly, situated within the context. He was a British scholar, but I want to touch on the imagination. I want to touch on their moral imagination just for a moment from John Paul Lederach, who's a wonderful guy. This book dates to 2005. And I had it for a longish time. And there are just a couple of little things I wanted to touch on. First of all, he defines the moral imagination, and I'm going to jump from him to Ursula Le Guin in a moment. He says this: I suggest and will explore the moral imagination as the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. Very much what good old Clarke is exploring in his pattern of expectation. So this sense that there's a real world that we are actually engaged with. And the only other point I want to pull from this book so far, we might come back to it at another time, is he makes this point time and again, where in small or large ways the shackles of violence are broken, we find a singular taproot that gives life to the moral imagination. The taproot being the capacity of individuals and communities to imagine themselves in a web of relationship even with their enemies. So that links up with people like Anne-Marie Brown talking about loving corrections. It also links up with what Johann Galton was exploring at the end of his book that we looked at last week, and so on. And of course I should say that good old John Paul Lederach is one of the best exponents of peace building and the theories and practices around that. So Ursula Le Guin, the words of my master, she makes the following point, and it's really it just riffs straight off this here. The opening essay in this collection of essays from her is called The Operating Instructions, and she's talking about literacy and our ability to have literature and the word take us to places beyond ourselves. Again, of course, the pattern of expectations is all about that, and I'll tell you more why in a moment. But she says, look, in her current period, and she's speaking particularly for America, but I think it could apply to Australia and lots of other places, literacy, she says, is, not so much about fantasy and imagination and all that sort of stuff. So she said it's so that you can read the operating instructions. So you can follow the instructions to do something. And she says, look, I think the imagination is the single most useful tool mankind, I would say humanity, possesses. It beats the opposable thumb. I can imagine living without my thumbs, she says, but without my but not without my imagination. So the whole purpose of this short paper, which is actually quite famous, it's quoted all over the internet by different people, is that, we are, as she says, a wordy species. The imagination is an essential tool of the mind, a fundamental way of thinking, an indispensable means of becoming and remaining human. I love that. So as a wordy species, we are tangling with words all the time. So that brings me to the pattern of expectation. Now, what's this book about? Well, he's charting the arc of futures-oriented literature, imagined literature, from 1644 to 2001, even though he hasn't got there yet. It's 1979. But he's looking at that, and then he's looking towards the third millennium. So he has a strong futures component. The first chapter in the book is called The Discovery of the Future. And he gives a really thorough historical account of the emergence of utopian and dystopian fantasy, science fiction, and so on. I was totally surprised to learn that there's this guy called Sébastien Mercier, who in the mid-18th century got this idea that he wanted to write about a future society. He was very unhappy with the Ancien Régime of France, and he wrote a book that appeared in about, I think, 1770, 1771. It was called The Year 2440. So he projected his imagination that far ahead. Extraordinary, and it was a big hit. It was published again and again. It was so popular, the Pope burnt it, the King of Spain banned it, and so on. So that's always the sign of a good book, if it's people wanting to ban it and suppress it. Okay, and he's looking at the truths of political philosophy, or the forces of history at work in the making of narrative, and the way early thinkers about the future just start trying to get their head around it, started formulating political theories around what an alternative world might be like. So what's his name? Thomas More gave us the Utopia, 1516, 1517, something like that. And this utopian idea was one where you'd find a place somewhere on the planet Earth that hadn't yet been found. One of the interesting things that he points out, that's as Clarke points out, is that when we actually had pretty much covered the planet with our footsteps and our ships and so on, we started having to invent futures in other places. For instance, futures, images of the perfect or good society somewhere else in the future, as opposed to somewhere like Thomas More's Utopia, which was an island that was not yet discovered, but housed the perfect society. So a few tastes here. I want to give you a few tastes. So there was a comment back here, a phrase he used which I particularly liked. Where was it? It was around here. That's funny. Oh, there it is. So he says, look, in a sense, these early attempts at writing futures literature, futures fantasy, they were heroic essays in the unpredictable. For their authors could only assume that the progress of science would increase the sum of human happiness. Their importance in their time, however, is beyond questioning. They mark the transition from the medieval preoccupation with the joys of an everlasting hereafter to those fascinations of an infinite progress of knowledge so typical of modern times. Their special value was to manifest a new sense of human destiny. So early futures fantasy, futures fiction you might call it, was about mapping out the potential for science and progress to improve us. And it was only in the early 20th century, with the First World War, then the Second World War, that we got a shift away from that to being somewhat skeptical about science and what it can do or can lead to if we do not have a moral compass of some kind. And it's really interesting because he's talking about this pattern, this shape of expectation. So he's thinking in terms of patterns, and his chapters, are about that, bad to worse, the exploration of the future, possibilities, probabilities, and predictions, and so on. He moving across, and he's giving us these different, what I would call genres of how authors between 1644 and let's say his own day of the 1970s, because he ends up with Ursula Le Guin and The Dispossessed and people like that, Kurt Vonnegut, how their location of a future links up with a critique in some way. And there's always the future in all of these writings, from the earliest to the latest, is offering a critique of the world that the authors inhabit. It's often laced with strong, clear political messages and so on. So I like this phrase. He says, look, the tale of the future becomes a hospital of the mind. Allegories of human wickedness, parables of social morality, surrealistic representations of recent history, hopeful and despairing prophecies of other times and other societies. These pour out in an extraordinary unburdening of the mind. So it's this charting, and then he takes a turn towards the macro historians. That's that book again that I waved at you the other day, where he's talking about Oswald Spengler, Peter Sorokin, Arnold Toynbee. Okay, they were to arrive at their final analysis of human history. The evident failure to achieve anything significant in the form of moral progress was contrasted with the incredible rapidity of our ability to improve the life experiences of people, particularly in the European context. So he talks, then he's referring to another term he uses right here, is that there are prophetic histories of the more purposeful tales of the future. Okay, and of course this is towards the end of the book. So now we're post First World War and Second World War. So the writings of Spengler, Sorokin and Toynbee represent a movement throughout Western countries to comprehend the condition of the 20th century. And the parallel development in dystopian fiction manifests a comparable effort of the imagination, both in Europe and the United States, to explicate the moral confusion of modern times. And pushing on towards the end, he talks, of course, George Orwell gets a strong mention, but there's up here, he starts talking about the study of the future. He talks about it very early as well, which in the 1970s was commonly called futurology. And it's, oops, that's sticking together. Where? There it is. He says, to construe the immense changes of the present age is the special task of new literature of the future. This grows in volume and continues to diversify in function as the prophets and forecasters construct the models of the world in the next decade or into the next millennium. One area of exceptionally rapid growth is this new practice of futurology. The word seems to have been coined in 1943 by Ossip Fleckheim, who was one of the first to argue for improvements in the descriptive methods that had dominated the future forecasts of the 1930s. At the end of the Second World War, he was once again in advance of his time in seeking to promote university courses about the future, on the ground that, to quote him now, this is Fleckheim, the last great obstacle towards an understanding of society is being removed through futurology. Instead of consulting the stars, the futurologist of 1945 can get his clues, or her, from historians and sociologists, from philosophers and psychologists, from political scientists and economists. The predictor was proved right, for that has been the way in which contemporary previsions of the future, that means anticipations, have evolved. And the prophet, Dana, that's the futurist of that time, has been proved right in his view. Remarkable for 1945 that the visions of utopian and dystopian fiction, to quote him again, daring and fantastic though they doubtlessly are, may yield insights that are more revealing than the voluminous writings of learned systems builders. So, the imagination, the use of the imagination to challenge, critique the world around us is very much what Ursula Le Guin is talking about there. There are two more little comments that I think I will read to you, and then I'm going to turn to one last... yes, that's right, look at that. There's some symmetry in my brain, even though I feel a little fuzzy today. I couldn't agree more with this statement. Futurology is an ugly and pretentious word. I think it's a horrible word. And it reminds me when I'm working with my third year history students, we have a paper by a very good pair of historians, the Sterns, husband and wife, Peter and I think Sandra or Susan Stern, in which they talk about emotionology. So this ology stuff kind of seeks to give a quality of authority to things like biology and sociology and so on. But futurology, emotionology, they just don't cut it. And it's no wonder that we don't use those terms anymore unless you're an absolute heathen from some place who's only just discovered futures and calls it futurology, having read a paper from 1960 or 70. But I'll just read a little bit more of that statement, and then I'm going to jump to the last one. Okay. Futurology is an ugly and pretentious word. It is, however, the best available means of naming the present stage of the evolution of the informed, professional estimate of future developments that began with the sociologists, town planners, and the military in the last quarter of the 19th century. Futurology is yet one more advance, so we're still thinking advance, you see, and progress in the specialization of intellectual labor. So, futures work, specialization of intellectual labor, what are we doing? We're seeking to harness the anticipatory imagination, the moral imagination, as our friend Lederach calls it, in order to explore and perhaps even generate pathways to preferred, inclusive, more humane and ecological kinds of futures. So where do we land with all of this? So he covers a whole bunch of, science fiction literature here, which I haven't even touched on really. But it's really important to understand that this literature has emerged and grown up around all the thinkers that I have talked about so far on the bookshelf. They have all done their reading, they've all enjoyed a good novel and so on. You can't have gone through as a thinker in the 20th century without having read Orwell or, some of the H.G. Wells stuff and that kind of thing. So, okay, he goes to this. Yes. That's where I wanted to come in. The prophecies and the predictions of the last 200 years show that the future is not accurately predictable, no kidding, on any scale nor in any detail. There are too many variables and no one can guess what changes may divert the apparent direction of human development. In other words, the linear kind of trajectories that we might assume are the real directions. It is a fact, however, that we cannot do without the prophets, story writers, and the predictors. We need them as we need the air we breathe. Think of Ursula Le Guin and her comment about the imagination. Okay. For they offer the only means by which individuals and nations can find their directions in a changing world. The proliferation of utopias and dystopias in the last 30 years is the work of the moral imagination, intent upon asserting the right conduct of human affairs in a time when the abuse of power, so familiar today, political, technological, threatens the continued existence of society. So that's Clarke, feeling somewhat overwhelmed in the 1970s, he was already, I think, the way he writes, in some ways, an old man, but in other ways, deeply engaged in the ongoing flow of futures and its field. He's represented in a book that I've misplaced, Richard Slaughter's wonderful 3-volume set, the knowledge base of futures studies, which came out in 1996, and I.F.Clarke has a chapter in there. So I want to just wrap this up though by coming back to another book, A Foot in the River, okay, Fernandez Amesto. And he says something rather succulent quite early on, and I thought I would share it with you, because what we have here now, I'm bringing in science fiction, fantasy. You know I love poetry and so on. And Fernandez and Amesto is looking at the shape of change and the limits of evolution and so on. And he's a historian and a really good philosopher. Gives a great chapter at the beginning here on the tensions between Heraclitus and Parmenides. One said that the river is never the same. You put your foot in a different river every time you meet it. That was Heraclitus or Heraclitus. And Parmenides says everything basically is window dressing. Behind everything is the same. But he makes his point about human culture. He says, I propose first that culture is a byproduct of faculties of memory and anticipation. Good, these guys. Evolved in some species. He's not saying it's just the human faculty. Second, that those faculties predispose cultures to change. They don't stand still. Third, that humans' faculty of anticipation is exceptionally developed and contributes to making them highly imaginative. This is why I'm bringing this in. Fourth, that humans are the most mutable of cultural creatures, because in their case, peculiar features of memory and imagination make them fertile in ideas. Again, the pattern of expectation, which I understand as ways of reimagining the world. Fifth, the ideas are the main motors of change in human culture. Ideas are the main motors. Again, think of what I.F.Clarke was saying at the end of his book. And finally, that the pace of change is a function of mutually accessible ideas. The more that ideas are exchanged, the more new ideas ensue, and cultural instability increases accordingly. Cultural instability increases accordingly. So I'm going to stop there. There are other sections of this book that I'd love to explore, but I've promised myself to really focus on books that came out before the year 2000. Hope this was interesting, and I look forward to discussing some elements of this when we meet.